This is part 3. Last time I said you didn't really have to watch the first part because I only made minor changes. Well, in part 2 I made changes that reverberate through every remaining film. Although honestly, if you just decided to click on part 3 of a rewrite of the Harry Potter series expecting to not be totally lost, then I kind of have to respect that. In fact, I'm changing my mind. Everyone who's seen the first 2 parts, leave. This is going to be for newcomers only. I want my comment section to be filled with nothing but completely confused people. I must admit, as I'm writing these exact words, I'm still not sure whether this will be the final installment of this series. Originally, my thoughts were that my rewrite of Harry Potter would only take 5 films. I believe that the first 2 films are fantastic movies, genuinely goated. Harry Potter is one of the great titans of fantasy, and these 2 films are definitely better than Star Wars, possibly better than Lord of the Rings. I'm a huge Tolkien fan, but I'd give them the edge. And one reason for that is these films are so dense. No scene and barely even a single line of dialogue is wasted. Every moment is telling us something about this world or our characters or the plot. Most of the time it's doing more than one of these things at once. I should maybe make a whole video gushing over these first 2 films at some point because there's just so much I could say. But the thing is, the later films don't have this same density of substance and efficiency in storytelling. Instead, you get way more of what just feels like filler that's not really adding anything. So my logic was, if you want to improve the series as a whole, that means making the whole series more like the first 2 films, which means making the plot way more dense, and that's done by reducing the number of films. Goblet of Fire is the worst film and has the least substantial plot, so should basically be cut entirely. Then, as we explored last video, the stories of Order of the Phoenix and the Half-Blood Prince could be combined into one complete story focused on Snape, so turning 2 films into one means 1 fewer film. And then the Deathly Hallows really didn't need to be 2 films when you look at what's in them, so that brings us down to just 5 films. Except that's a bit silly because I didn't just combine those 2 films, as that would make an insanely long movie. Instead, as you'll see momentarily, I cut out quite a lot that can then be slotted back into another complete movie. But still, if we want to make these films like the first 2, we have to remember the first 2 films were 2 hours and 40 minutes long, so actually we've been consistently adding to every film since then in order to bring it up to that runtime, and obviously the whole point is to avoid filler. What I also want to avoid is just adding a load of my own stuff. These rewrites are me reworking the original material to show how just a few small changes can make a big difference to a film. So far, that's what I've done. I really haven't added that much. Because at that point, this would just be presenting fan fiction, rather than what's thus far functioned as much more of a commentary on how the original material could have been better employed to produce quality content. So if you want to hold me accountable, then know that I'm saying now, my main goal here is to, wherever possible, just avoid making up a plot wholesale, but I also want to recognize what parts of the original material work and respond accordingly. By the way, all of this becomes even worse for the final film because that's actually the shortest one, while simultaneously being the big finale that, if anything, should feel more epic and climactic and thus longer. Speaking of that final film, let's just acknowledge the Deathly Hallows is kind of bad. Like, first of all, you basically have the same story that pretty much just repeats twice in a row. They have to go get a Horcrux, but it's held in an institution where security would be a top priority. However, they're able to get through the security by using Polyjuice Potion, and then they have to find a means of destroying the Horcrux. In the process, they get wet. It's not just that these 2 events happen one after the other and are incredibly similar, right down to the fact that the caretaker of the Horcrux is an evil woman specifically. It's also the fact this isn't even entertaining to begin with. As I said, their main method in both cases is just to walk into the place while using Polyjuice Potion. That's not clever, that's not interesting, and it's definitely a huge plot hole that these institutions can be fooled by a bunch of teenagers using an incredibly common potion. I don't think that should even be possible. There are other issues with this plot too. The way that them carrying around a locket and struggling to destroy it as it slowly corrupts them and turns them against each other is incredibly derivative of the Lord of the Rings. Also, the fact that Harry just casually uses Imperio and it's not treated like a big deal at all. I hate that. These are called unforgivable curses. That these are curses that good people simply do not use is well established, so to have your main character go against that feels like an absolute betrayal. It would be fine if this was part of a plot point of Harry becoming more evil and corrupt. a bit like I did in the previous part of this series, but that's not the context here. Still, the biggest issue is just how uncreative it is to have them track down 2 Horcruxes in the exact same way. Also, the next Horcrux, in the form of the diadem, they just find out where it is by asking someone. In fact, there's never any moment of them intuiting what a Horcrux is or where it comes from in these later films, except for maybe Helga Hufflepuff's cup, which they work out is probably in Bellatrix's vault based on how she reacts when she thinks they got into it. This is all so disappointing because the first 2 films had a fantastic mystery element to them, where Harry, Ron and Hermione slowly worked stuff out as they discovered new information and actively pursued opportunities to learn more. And I think one of the biggest issues here is that 7 Horcruxes is simply too many. Why have them pursue Slytherin's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, and Ravenclaw's diadem if the act of finding them is a little more than a fetch quest? And that's before getting into the fact that they also have to find the Sword of Gryffindor.
But don't expect me to be grateful just because now there's another damn thing we've got to find.
But wouldn't Voldemort only have a connection to Slytherin's locket? Why not make that the main Horcrux they're looking for and build up a proper story around that? Especially if the big final film isn't even named after the Horcruxes, but the Deathly Hallows. The Resurrection Stone, Invisibility Cloak and Elder Wand apparently collectively make someone the Master of Death, which would seem really significant. But they're sort of introduced as an afterthought, and the Horcruxes and the Elder Wand are kind of competing for attention as the main MacGuffins. This is the reason why I actually introduced the Deathly Hallows in my previous rewrite, because being Master of Death is a pretty big deal, so that warrants a lot of setup. So I was trying to think of some way to make discovering the identity of Horcruxes interesting, and I think I've come up with something pretty good. See, I mentioned that I don't like the idea of just inventing my own ideas for these rewrites, although sometimes it's necessary, but what I would certainly be happy to do is introduce content from the books that wasn't featured in the films. Now, I have read the books, but only when I was a child, so I decided to just look up a video about the differences between the books and the films, and I actually didn't find that much from the books that seemed worth including. In fact, this guy is going to catch some strays for a second. He complains about every single change the movies made from the books.
And in the film, we get yet another awful line added that makes Harry seem like an arrogant asshole.
She's only interested in you because she thinks you're the chosen one.
But I am the chosen one.
That line is hilarious, possibly my favourite line of dialogue from the whole film. Anyway, the one thing I did find interesting is that apparently the backstory of Voldemort is explored a lot more through the Pensieve, and I'd already been thinking the real issue is Voldemort made these Horcruxes in the past, so if you wanted to find out about one, you'd want to go into the past, kind of like a time heist. So my thought was simple. The limitation with Pensieves is that you can only witness the memory from the perspective of the person who had the memory, but what if there was some way you could step outside the frame of the memory and actually follow characters? Well, then you'd be able to find out what they got up to in the past, watching them as an unseen observer. And that is the main focus of this plot. That's the goal around which the story has been centered, using this potential to discover the identity and location of the Horcrux. The funny thing is, after all that talk about admittedly coming up with quite a novel plot idea, I'm going to start the film very much by taking the content we've so far not used from the original stories. This means we start with Harry and Dudley getting attacked by Dementors. This time, instead of Dudley mocking Harry for mourning Cedric, he's mocking him about Severus's death. Then, when Harry rescues Dudley using the Patronus, he's expelled. Fortunately, the Order show up to bring him to the Burrow, where he'll be more safe, but there's concern the Death Eaters might try to ambush them, so there's the same efforts to protect him that we see in the Deathly Hallows Part 1. I think this would be a good time to address something that bothers me in the original films. How many Death Eaters are there? I mean, ages ago I asked how many wizards there are in general, considering that there's just one school for the entire UK, and it seems to contain no more than 1,000 students. But once Voldemort rises, we then have to ask how many Death Eaters are there, and what proportion of wizards are evil, because it seems to be quite a lot. Just know that the number of Death Eaters is a lot smaller in my rewrite, as I think that makes the most sense. That night, Harry goes to sleep and has a vision of Voldemort interrogating Ollivander. This makes Harry reflect on the dark place his connection to Voldemort took him last year. Having a crisis of conscience, he tries to leave in the middle of the night, but instead he is stopped by Ron, and they have the same conversation about Harry leaving that they have in the film, except Harry would focus a lot more on his lack of faith in himself, especially since he now knows from the vision that Voldemort is actively pursuing the Elder Wand, and we already know he has the Resurrection Stone, so he might soon be 2/3 of the way to being a master of death. The next morning, Harry is taken by Arthur to the Ministry of Magic, where he is cleared of all charges thanks to the testimony of Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore especially points out that Harry has strengthened his mind thanks to the training from Severus Snape and is much better able to resist Voldemort. Harry then has to confront his behaviour last year further as Dumbledore takes him to see Slughorn, who is still a bit freaked out about Harry's darker actions. Since Slughorn already taught potions last year, the focus will be less on getting him to join and more on getting him to recognise that Harry's sorry for intruding on his mind. Harry asks why Slughorn so urgently needs to return, and Dumbledore says that his skill with potions will be essential to defeat the Dark Lord now he has returned. So now unexpelled, it's time for Harry to return to school and confront the fact that Snape is no longer alive to be Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher and has instead been replaced by Dolores Umbridge. Umbridge's scenes are some of the best in the later Harry Potter films, as she's just such a fantastic villain to hate, not only because of her refusal to accept that Voldemort has returned, but the way she joyfully tortures Harry in an effort to get him to deny the truth. Very Orwellian. After this, we fortunately get a much more welcome lesson with Slughorn teaching potions. Slughorn gets out a Pensieve and introduces the idea that the vials used for Pensieves are a type of potion. As such, he tasks the class with discovering who can, using potions, make a convincing vision for a Pensieve. The winner will be awarded a vial of liquid luck as a reward. Harry goes to hand in his Half-Blood Prince notebook from last year as he doesn't think he deserves to have a competitive advantage, but Slughorn assures him this is cutting-edge magic and as such an old book would be of no extra use to him in this exercise. And indeed, Harry finds that he struggles with the task and it's Hermione who produces the best vision and wins the liquid luck. However, she gives it to Harry with the reasoning that he usually needs more luck. I'll say now that liquid luck is depowered in this version for obvious reasons. It doesn't mean that basically everything you do will succeed, but just that luck will tend to be in your favour. Although, as Slughorn will later point out, it's not always clear what outcomes in an endeavour are actually governed by luck. Finally, Slughorn also selects Hermione for a special extracurricular project alongside Luna Lovegood and also Harry. This is the first strong indication that Slughorn hopes to reconcile with Harry after last year. Next, we get the whole Ron Quidditch thing with the liquid luck fake out and also the drama of him kissing Lavender, before later on they head down to Hogsmeade to do some drinking and Harry first starts hearing whispers that he should restart Dumbledore's army since Dolores isn't teaching them any lessons. However, as already mentioned, Harry has very little confidence in his own sense of morality, so he's incredibly resistant to taking on any sort of leadership role. On their way back, they see a student nearly killed by a cursed necklace that she was supposed to give to Dumbledore, and we can infer from this that somebody is trying to assassinate him. On top of this, we also see Dolores becoming more authoritarian in the school, and the beginning of her tyranny as she imposes cruel and arbitrary rules on the students. And to represent 3 films in as many sequential scenes, we then have the family returning to the Burrow for the wedding between Bill and Fleur. Although frankly, I have no idea why Bill and Fleur are getting married. She seems entirely out of his league. One thing I'm not going to include is the Burrow being attacked and burnt, partly for time and partly because I like the idea of the Burrow as a safe space, and if the Death Eaters can easily attack it, why didn't they do that much earlier? However, if the film needs a bit of action, we'll get it now, as when Harry sleeps, he finds that he gets attacked by Dementors in his dreams. He consults the Order about this, and they reveal that very dark magic could see Dementors being able to attack people not just in the real world, but in their own minds. After returning to Hogwarts, Harry decides to take his mind training more seriously. Since Snape is no longer around, Harry needs to mostly focus on meditating himself, but there are plenty of distractions from all the romance drama due to all these students still being hormone-addled teenagers. Harry does eventually decide to get rid of the Half-Blood Prince book, as Snape was clearly in a dark place when he wrote it, and it's tied up with a lot of negative memories. So he has Ginny hide it, and like in the film, she plants a cheeky kiss on him. I do like this moment with the kiss, but I will admit my reason for Harry hiding the book is weaker than it was in the original film. It's one of many situations where in solving one problem you create others, and you can't have everything you want. In short, I don't really find Draco compelling as a character, which is why you'll notice he's pretty absent from these stories. But that means there's no reason for Harry to seriously lash out at him, and that in turn means disposing of the book isn't as serious. Having made progress in controlling his mind and resisting Voldemort, Harry decides he's comfortable with restarting Dumbledore's army, but this time he takes much less of a leadership role as he's more aware of his limitations, although he is clearly doing much better at resisting Voldemort's influence on his mind. Unfortunately, it's clear there are other vulnerabilities to be negotiated as Ron consumes some chocolate laced with love potion, and in trying to cure him, Slughorn poisons him with a celebratory drink from a bottle originally originally intended for Dumbledore. This again communicates that clearly the Death Eaters fear Dumbledore and are trying to take him out surreptitiously. Dumbledore shows up to assess the situation, and after they're sure Ron is safe, Harry finally asks Dumbledore what exactly their plan is to take down Voldemort. With this, Dumbledore takes out a Pensieve and shows Harry another vision of Voldemort. Like I say, the point of centering the Pensieve again in this plot, even as it was significant in the previous film as well, is that it's a fantastic way to provide exposition and give an insight into Voldemort's backstory. I could get into exactly what this vision would show, but honestly the specifics of it wouldn't matter, so I'll leave this as a call for engagement. What would you like to see presented from Voldemort's backstory in this vision? You can either go for something from the established lore, or make something up that you think would be an interesting addition to his character. When the memory ends with Voldemort leaving, Harry says he doesn't understand the relevance. Dumbledore says the point is that around the time of this memory, they believe Voldemort created his first Horcrux. If they were able to follow him beyond the scope of these memories, they might be able to actually see where he hid it. Dumbledore says that it's theorized, and perhaps in the past practically proven, that it's possible to create a potion that would allow someone to not just witness a memory from the perspective of the person who had that memory, but to walk outside the bounds of that person's perspective. As such, a memory enhanced in this way would function as a lens by which one would be able to view the past. Dumbledore leaves, and Harry is about to follow him before Slughorn calls after him and says, "I'm sorry." Harry is confused for a moment and asks what Slughorn is sorry about. Slughorn says he's sorry that he was too afraid last year to reveal what he knew about Voldemort. This moment of vulnerability from Slughorn allows the two to entirely pave over the tension between them from last year and put Harry in a much better mental state. So when we see him continuing to train the army, he's much more enthused and active about it, but unfortunately this is also when the army is discovered by Umbridge and Dumbledore is forced to flee as he is suspected of instigating the army as some sort of treason. We follow the fifth film quite closely now, with Hagrid expressing concern about his giant brother being at risk if Dumbledore isn't around anymore to protect Hagrid's job. And then we get another of my favourite scenes where Fred and George disrupt the final exams on their broomsticks with fireworks as an act of rebellion against Umbridge's tyranny. But the fact it's final exams leaves Harry with a sense of frustration. He has been working on the potions lessons to try to discover a means to achieve what Dumbledore was planning, but he's getting frustrated. So he goes for a walk where he happens upon Slughorn, and they then both see Hagrid mourning the dead Aragog. Slughorn collects some venom before they hold a funeral service for him and commiserate with Hagrid. But actually, Slughorn is quite happy because he thinks this venom could be part of a viable recipe. However, he's only got a little of it and is worried about not pulling off the mixing phase. At this point, Harry suggests using the liquid luck to give them an edge in this process. Slughorn says it's not clear whether the success of such a task would be governed by luck more than skill, but they decide it's worth a shot anyway. And it turns out a success, giving them effectively a lens by which they can spy on Voldemort and discover the location of his Horcrux, so Harry brings together Ron and Hermione to enter the memory with him and investigate. I do want to keep it ambiguous how Horcruxes are actually made, because it's always kind of bothered me that the only thing we're told necessary to create them is murder. Not to say murder is nothing, but murder is incredibly common in all forms of fantasy action adventure media. Bad guys kill people all the time. So the idea that Horcruxes are some inexpressibly dark magic and then you make them just by killing someone, it seems a little tame. I think more likely to create a Horcrux should involve some kind of horrible torture. One thought I'd have is that to rip one's soul apart is unsurprisingly incredibly painful, far more pain than any one person could possibly survive, so the way you create a Horcrux is by transferring that pain onto others, thus not just killing them, but torturing them in an extreme way. Indeed, one reason we don't see the actual act of creating a Horcrux is that even just the beginning of it is so dark that it causes a rift in the soul that permeates even into the memory itself, causing the memory to become slightly corrupted. In this moment of mental weakness, suddenly some Dementors enter the vision and Harry has to fight them off with a Patronus. Rushing to find Voldemort again, they're eventually able to find him with Salazar Slytherin's locket, which they rightly infer is the Horcrux. And I must admit, I struggled for a while to think about where someone like Voldemort would actually keep a piece of his soul to be confident it was safe. Frankly, I don't think he'd just leave it in a house or in the room of requirement. Instead, I think they would see Voldemort giving it to his loyal follower Lucius Malfoy, who then makes an incision in his abdomen to conceal the locket in his very flesh. Voldemort then heals the wound and ensures it is decidedly hidden where nobody would think to look. That is, nobody who hadn't just been able to witness this clandestine hiding spot. A final obstacle before they head off to retrieve the locket is that Umbridge tries to intercept and capture them, and we get the same scene from the Order of the Phoenix with Umbridge genuinely being willing to use the Cruciatus Curse and then eventually being taken away by the Centaurs. Thus, they're free to head to Malfoy Manor. Obviously, with no desire to hurt Lucius, their plan is to knock him out so he won't feel any pain, and then heal him, potentially so that he doesn't even know the locket is missing. Unfortunately, they are captured by Bellatrix Lestrange, and we have a very similar scene to where they're captured in Malfoy Manor in the 7th movie. One big change is that in this version, Peter Pettigrew dies in the same way described in the books. I previously said that most of the stuff from the books absent from the movies doesn't really bother me. It's not stuff I think would dramatically improve the films. But Peter's death is the exception. For those who don't know, he basically considers helping Ron and Harry, but in that moment the artificial hand he was given by Voldemort then chokes him to death, as it was intended to kill him if it sensed the slightest deviation in his loyalty. So with Peter dead, they're able to escape, but before they do they have to cut the locket from Lucius. This wouldn't be too gruesome, the cut isn't that deep. However, of course, they then get accosted by Voldemort, who would kill them if they weren't then rescued by Dumbledore. However, one way this will not be departing from the movies is that Dumbledore dies. In his duel with Voldemort, it's suddenly revealed that Albus possesses the Elder Wand. Realizing this, Voldemort throws everything he can at Dumbledore, but the real turning point is when Lucius is able to get a cheeky Expelliarmus in and disarm him. At this point, Dumbledore is killed, and of course Harry, Ron and Hermione make sure to retrieve his body and apparate away. Significant time is dedicated to mourning him, but after that is over, we return to Voldemort, who holds out his hand for the wand from Lucius. When Lucius goes to hand it over, Voldemort stabs him, reiterating that according to the Deathly Hallows tale, it cannot have two masters. He reaches a vial to Lucius's weeping eyes as he collects a memory of his final moments. We then wrap up with a combination of the final scenes from Order of the Phoenix and Half-Blood Prince. Basically, Harry talks to Luna, and then talks to Hermione about his plan for next year to defeat Voldemort. But these two scenes, while they wrap up Harry's story for this film, are not the final scene. The final scene is Draco stumbling upon Voldemort and his dead father. Voldemort says he'll show Draco what happened, where he sees a vision of Lucius's final moments that cuts off just as he's stabbed by Hermione to retrieve the locket. The image is pretty clear. Harry and his friends murdered Draco's father. And at this point, Voldemort offers him the opportunity for revenge. Anyway everyone, I hope you enjoyed. I'll be honest, I am aware that as this series continues, I'm sort of departing from the main point of it. I said the goal was to just focus on switching up what's already there rather than adding all my own stuff, but I realised that's impossible. It's why I'm most proud of my Prisoner of Azkaban rewrite, because that just involves slightly tweaking the original material. Meanwhile, let's be honest, my final rewrite coming soon will barely be a rewrite, because it's where all my other rewrites will culminate as I have to bring it home. Still, if I was going to add my own ideas, I wanted them to have a clear purpose, and that was to make the way that they discover the location of the Horcrux interesting and satisfying, and I hope I've achieved that. Anyway, please do all the algorithm things and make sure to click this video here as YouTube thinks you'll like it, and it's the most effective way to help the channel.